Have you ever wondered what really happens when something goes wrong in the middle of the ocean? Miles from land, miles from help, miles from anyone who has to answer for it? Every year, thousands of passengers vanish from cruise ships, and most cases are never solved. What happens in international waters stays in international waters. I've spent months collecting accounts from passengers and crew who witnessed things they were never supposed to talk about. Welcome to Bleak Fears. Before we begin, names, locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect everyone involved. But every single story you're about to hear is real. Drop your location and local time in the comments, and let's begin. The third time I sailed that route, I stopped believing in coincidences. Mediterranean loop, 11 nights, the kind of cruise where everything is designed to feel effortless. The food appears, the music plays, the ocean stays at a polite distance behind thick glass. I'd done it twice before, solo both times. I knew which deck got the best sunset, which dining room was quietest on Tuesdays, which corridor smelled like the kitchen vents and was worth avoiding after 9. I knew the rhythm of it. So when something broke that rhythm, I felt it before I could name it. She was already seated when I arrived at the dining table that first night. Table for 8, assigned seating, the kind of arrangement that forces conversation whether you want it or not. She sat directly across from me. Mid-40s, I'd guess. Dark hair pulled back loosely. She had the look of someone who had dressed carefully but without much interest in being noticed. She ordered wine. She barely touched it. When we went around the table introducing ourselves the way strangers do when they have no choice, she said her name was Claire. From Edinburgh. Traveling alone. I didn't think anything of it. Half the people on solo cruises are running from something or recovering from something, and neither is anyone else's business. I smiled. She smiled back. The conversation moved on. By the second night, I'd spoken to her maybe 4 or 5 times total. She was pleasant, measured. She'd answer a question fully and then go quiet. Turning slightly toward the window like the water outside was part of a conversation the rest of us weren't invited into. There was nothing alarming about her. She was just elsewhere, present in body, located somewhere else entirely in her mind. On the 4th night, she wasn't at dinner. I didn't think much of it. Room service exists for a reason. The buffet on deck 9 runs until midnight, and nobody judges you for eating alone up there with a plate of pasta and a view of open water. People have off nights. I had one myself on the second sailing when I spent an entire evening in my cabin reading and didn't speak to a single person until breakfast. She wasn't there the 5th night either. I ran into 2 of our tablemates the following afternoon. A couple from somewhere in the north of England who had appointed themselves the social coordinators of our little group and treated every ship activity like a competitive sport. I asked casually if they'd seen Claire around. The woman stopped walking. "Who?" she said. "Claire," I said. "From our table. Dark hair, sits across from me, Edinburgh." They looked at each other. Not a quick glance, a longer look, the kind that means something is being silently negotiated. "There are 7 of us at that table," the man said. "There's always been 7. Now here is where your mind does something interesting. It doesn't immediately go to anything strange, it goes to logistics. Wrong table. Wrong sailing. I misheard a name in a noisy dining room and constructed a person out of coincidence and ambient detail. That's what I told myself walking to the guest services desk. I just wanted to confirm she existed so I could stop feeling like I was losing my grip on a straightforward memory. The woman at the desk was helpful, genuinely trying. She typed the name in 2 or 3 different ways, searched by first name alone, asked if I had a cabin number or a booking reference. I had nothing. I knew her face and the way she looked at the water and the fact that she'd ordered red wine and left most of it in the glass. No record of the name. No record of the cabin. No passenger matching the description on my dining assignment. I went back to the table that night and counted the chairs. 7. There was a slight gap between 2 of them on the far side. Just enough space that an 8th chair could have sat there without crowding anyone. Or maybe it was always a 7-person table and I'd manufactured an entire human being out of 4 evenings of background noise. Except I remember the wine glass. I remember it sitting at the place setting across from mine on the second night, the lipstick mark on the rim, the way the red had dried down slightly on one side because it had been sitting untouched so long. You don't invent details like that. You don't invent the specific way someone tilts their head when they're listening but thinking about something else. I've tried every rational explanation. Mistaken table, but I sat at the same table every night and my assigned card matched the number. Misremembered name possible, but the description, the seat, the presence of her is solid in a way that a misheard name doesn't account for. A stowaway sophisticated enough to insert herself into assigned dining seating, eat with guests for 3 nights, and then disappear without triggering a single flag on a ship where every movement is theoretically logged. That doesn't track either. What I keep returning to isn't the disappearance. It's the expression on the couple's faces when I asked. Not confusion. Not amusement at the possibility I'd gotten mixed up. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, if I'm being precise about it, like relief. Like they were glad I was the one asking the question instead of someone official. I finished the voyage. I ate at that table every remaining night. Nobody mentioned her. Nobody left a gap. The conversation filled in around the space where she'd been the way water fills in around a pulled hand. Immediate, total, and leaving no trace that anything had been there at all. I haven't booked that route again. I keep thinking about the wine she left in the glass. The way she looked at the window. Whatever she was searching for out there in all that dark water. I don't know if she found it. I don't know if she was supposed to be on that ship. I'm not entirely sure, and I've sat with this for 2 years now, that she was supposed to be anywhere at all. Her name was Claire. She was from Edinburgh. She traveled alone. And according to every record that ship kept, she never existed. I don't tell this story to be believed. I tell it because keeping it inside has a weight to it that I've carried for 6 years and I'm done carrying it alone. 11 years on cruise vessels. Security department. I've worked repositioning cruises, world loops, Caribbean runs, transatlantic crossings. I've seen the full spectrum of what happens when you put thousands of people in a floating city and cut them off from the rest of the world for days at a time.
Very strained passengers.
I've talked people down from ledges, literally. I've stood in cabins where terrible things happened and written reports in the flat, procedural language that turns human catastrophe into a filing reference. I know how ships work. I know how ships handle things they don't want handled loudly. I understand the machinery of it, the silence, the paperwork, the way an incident can be administratively smoothed until it has no edges left. What I found on Subdeck C on that repositioning cruise in the autumn of 2019 had no edges I could smooth. I tried. I was told to try, and I have thought about those handwritten pages every single week since. It was a repositioning cruise, moving the vessel from one seasonal deployment to another. Passenger load was thin, maybe 40% capacity. The kind of sailing where the ship feels slightly too large for the people inside it, where corridors stay empty at hours they'd normally be busy, where you become aware of how much ship there is below the waterline that passengers never see and never think about. Subdeck C was one of those spaces. Maintenance storage, generator housing, crew infrastructure. Restricted. Standard keycard access. Manual latch backup. I walked it every 72 hours as part of my rotation. 2 previous walkthroughs on that voyage had been clean. On the 3rd walkthrough, the door to corridor C7 was standing open. Not ajar. Open. Fully. The manual latch was disengaged. The keycard panel showed no recent access log, which itself was irregular, because that panel logged every entry including authorized ones. Both locks had been released from the inside. From inside a corridor that, according to every system on that ship, had not been accessed in 11 days. I didn't go straight in. I stood at the threshold for a moment, called out, got nothing back. The motion sensor lighting tripped when I stepped inside. Fluorescent strips flickering on in sequence down the length of the corridor. 30 meters of pipe housing and conduit and the low mechanical hum of the ship's infrastructure breathing around you. I walked the length of it slowly. At the far end, pushed against the wall where the corridor dog-legged toward a generator access panel, was a living space. I want to be precise because precision is the only way to convey what this actually looked like. It wasn't the desperate nest of someone who'd crawled aboard in a port and lasted 3 days on stolen food. This was organized, considered. A sleeping roll tightly made up the way a bunk gets made on a military vessel. flat, tucked, deliberate, a battery-powered camp lamp sitting on an upturned plastic crate. Beside it, a stack of sealed food containers, the kind pulled from crew catering stores, enough for weeks, sorted by type. Clothing folded in a neat column against the wall. A small washcloth dry and hung over a pipe. A toothbrush in a travel case. And beside the sleeping roll, weighted down at the corner by the lamp base, a stack of handwritten pages. I looked at them. I didn't touch them, but I crouched down and I looked. They weren't diary entries. They weren't a letter. They weren't the scattered writing of someone in psychological distress, which is what part of my brain was hoping to categorize this as. A stowaway, confused, unwell, something I had a protocol for. The pages were lists, column after column of names. And next to each name, a cabin number, deck designation, what looked like a time notation beside some of them. Passenger names. From the current manifest, as far as I could tell from the ones I recognized. Organized, cross-referenced, updated, because the pages closest to the top of the stack had entries that corresponded to passengers who had boarded at the last port stop for days into the voyage. Whoever had been living in that corridor had been tracking the passengers. Current passengers. By name, by cabin, by something I couldn't fully decode in the 30 seconds I spent looking before I stood up and radioed it in. The chief security officer arrived in under 5 minutes. He was calm in the way that people are calm when they've already decided what to do before they've seen what they're dealing with. He walked the space. He looked at the sleeping roll, the food, the clothing. He crouched at the pages the same way I had. He stayed there a beat longer than I expected. Then he stood, turned to me and said, and I have reconstructed this carefully over 6 years because I knew even in the moment that I needed to hold on to the exact words. This gets logged as a maintenance irregularity. No incident report. No escalation to fleet. You found an unsecured door and you secured it. That's the entry. The job now is to forget the corridor number. I asked if we were searching the ship for a stowaway. He looked at me and said nothing. I asked if we needed to cross-check the passenger manifest for anyone unaccounted for. He said the passenger manifest wasn't within my operational scope. I asked, and I don't know what made me push this far, something in the steadiness of his face that felt rehearsed. I asked if this had happened before. On this ship. On any ship. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder, the way someone does when they want the conversation to be over, and he walked out of the corridor. By my next rotation, the space was clean. Not tidied, chemically sanitized. The kind of clean that isn't about hygiene, it's about the removal of evidence. The smell of the disinfectant hit me from the threshold. The sleeping roll was gone. The food containers, the clothing, the lamp, the pages. Every surface wiped. I stood at the entrance for a long time. The motion sensors had even been reset. The lights took a half-second longer to trip than they had before, the way they do after a system reboot. I filed the maintenance irregularity entry as instructed. For lines. Unsecured door, corridor C7, subdeck C. Door secured by security officer during routine walkthrough. No further action required. I requested a vessel transfer at the end of that contract. I gave a scheduling reason. Nobody questioned it. What I think about, what I have thought about every week for 6 years, isn't the living space. It's not even the lists, though the lists are what wakes me up sometimes. It's the timeline. Whoever maintained that space had been on the ship for weeks. They had current passenger information, updated after the last port stop. They had organized that information with a system, not randomly, not obsessively in the way of someone unraveling, but methodically, purposefully, with a reason. I don't know what the reason was. I don't know if the person was ever found. I don't know if the passengers on those lists ever knew their names were written in a sealed corridor 40 feet below where they slept. The chief security officer retired the following year. I looked him up once a few years after. He looked fine. He looked like a man who had forgotten a corridor number the way he was told to. I never forgot it. C7. Subdeck C. The autumn of 2019. A sleeping roll made up tight as a military bunk and a stack of pages covered in the names of people who had no idea they were being watched. Someone on that ship knew exactly who was on board, where they slept, and when. And when we found the room, they were already gone. The sound was not what woke me. What woke me was the silence after it. We'd been asleep since around 11. 2 adults, 2 kids. My daughter was 9, my son had just turned 7. It was their first cruise. The whole trip had been built around that fact, around their faces at the buffet, their excitement about the pool deck, the way my son had pressed his nose against the porthole the first morning and said the ocean looked fake, like someone had painted it. We were 4 nights in. Caribbean loop, warm water, the kind of itinerary designed to be completely uncomplicated. We were in a midship cabin on deck 7. Standard interior, 2 twin pullouts for the kids along the far wall, and the main bed wedged under the air conditioning unit that ran slightly too cold, no matter what we set it to. I woke at 3:17. I know the exact time because the cabin clock was directly in my eye line from the pillow, and I remember looking at it with the specific focus of someone whose brain has snapped alert before the rest of them has caught up. The room was dark. The AC was humming. My husband was asleep beside me. The kids were breathing on the other side of the cabin. Everything was the way it should be. And then I heard it again, through the wall to our left. The walls between cabins on cruise ships are not thick. You learn this quickly. You hear neighbors laughing, arguing, running showers at odd hours, letting doors bang. You build a tolerance for it. This was not any of that. This was a sound I could not immediately categorize, which is the thing about it that locked my attention so completely. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't the television. It was rhythmic, slow and rhythmic with a slight variation every 4th or 5th beat, like something being set down and picked up, set down and picked up, measured, patient. I lay there for what felt like several minutes just listening. My husband hadn't moved. I didn't wake him yet because I kept waiting for the sound to resolve into something ordinary. A passenger reorganizing luggage at 3 in the morning, some eccentric insomniac with a strange hobby, anything that would let me roll over and go back to sleep. Then the child's voice came through the wall. Not crying, not frightened, talking in a low, continuous murmur, the way children talk when they're narrating something to themselves, the way my own kids sounded when they played alone and didn't know I was listening. A small voice, steady, saying something I couldn't make out through the wall. And then the rhythmic sound stopped. Complete stop. No trailing off, no gradual settling. One beat it was there, the next it wasn't, and the silence that replaced it was so total and so sudden that it felt engineered. Like a door closing on a room full of sound. Like something had been switched off. I woke my husband. I told him what I'd heard and watched his face do what faces do in the dark on a family cruise when your wife wakes you at 3 in the morning. The brief involuntary skepticism, the reassessment when he reads that I'm genuinely unsettled. He listened at the wall for a few minutes. Nothing. He tried to talk me down gently. Kids in the next cabin, he said. Probably a family like ours. Kid couldn't sleep, was entertaining itself. The sound carried strangely through those walls, made ordinary things feel strange. I almost accepted that. I wanted to accept that. But the next morning at breakfast I mentioned it to a crew member, one of the junior staff who worked the morning dining room, someone I'd spoken to a few times over the previous days and felt comfortable approaching. I described the cabin, the time, what I'd heard. I framed it lightly, almost as a passing observation, because I didn't want to be the woman who filed a noise complaint about what was probably nothing. He stopped what he was doing. Not dramatically, just a small pause, a fraction of a second where his hands stopped moving and his expression went somewhere neutral and careful. He told me he'd pass it along to guest services. I thanked him and didn't think about it again until that afternoon when a woman in a blazer knocked on our cabin door and introduced herself as being from the guest experience team. She asked me to describe what I'd heard. I did. She wrote something down. She asked if the children had been disturbed. I said no, they'd slept through it. She smiled in the way that people smile when they're performing calm rather than feeling it and told me they'd look into it. Here is where it shifts. Because that evening my husband went to the pool deck and got talking to another passenger. A semi-retired man traveling with his wife, very social, the type who knows everyone's business on a ship within 48 hours of boarding. Somehow the subject of the previous night came up. My husband mentioned what I'd heard. The man's expression changed. His wife had heard something too, he said. Not the same night. 2 nights earlier. Through the wall of their cabin on deck 7. A different section of the same corridor. A rhythmic sound she couldn't identify. and a voice low, he said. Not a child's voice. Something she had described to him as sounding like a recording of a child's voice. Slightly wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. Flat, maybe, without the breath in it. My husband came back to the cabin and told me this, and neither of us slept particularly well that night. The next morning I went to guest services directly and asked, plainly, whether the cabin next to ours was occupied. I didn't ask what they'd found. I just asked who was next door. The woman at the desk checked her screen. She told me that cabin, the one directly to our left, the one the sound had come through, had been listed as unoccupied for the duration of the voyage. A booking that had been cancelled pre-departure. No one had been assigned to it. No one had checked in. I asked about the security footage for the corridor. Not aggressively, just had anyone looked at it in the course of checking what I'd reported. She said she'd have to refer that question to the guest experience team. The same woman in the blazer called me back within the hour. She told me they had reviewed the corridor footage for the time frame I had described. She said the footage showed nothing of concern. I asked if I could see it. She said that wasn't something they were able to share with guests for privacy reasons, which is a policy I understand in principle, but the way she delivered it, the precise, careful wording of it, sat wrong with me. Not evasive exactly. Rehearsed. The way a sentence sounds when it has been used before, in the same situation with the same inflection. That evening I walked the Deck 7 corridor myself. Our cabin was 7,142. The cabin to our left, the one I'd been hearing through the wall, was 7144. I stood outside it for a moment. Standard door, standard handle, the little privacy light unlit. I put my hand on the door. Not to open it, just contact. Just to stand there with my palm flat against the surface the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself something is ordinary. The door was warm. Not from corridor ambient temperature, warmer than that. Warmer than a sealed, empty, air-conditioned cabin should be. I took my hand off it and walked back to our room. We didn't hear anything else for the remaining 2 nights of the voyage. I checked on the kids more than I needed to. My husband and I barely talked about it in the time remaining. Not because we'd resolved it, but because there was nothing to resolve. The ship docked. We disembarked. My son said the ocean still looked painted, and my daughter had already started planning which cruise she wanted to do next. 3 weeks after we got home, I found an online forum, one of those cruise review communities where passengers share experiences on specific ships and routes. I wasn't looking for this specifically. I was looking for something else entirely, a question about luggage storage, and I fell into a thread. The thread was about Deck 7, about that ship, about a specific section of that corridor. For separate posts over 2 years, from 4 separate passengers, none of whom appeared to know each other. All of them reporting the same thing, sounds through the wall, a rhythmic noise at night, something that stopped too suddenly. One of them mentioned a voice, described it the same way the man's wife had described it to my husband. Flat, slightly wrong, like a recording played back on a device that couldn't quite capture the original. Every post ended the same way. Unoccupied cabin next door. Crew with no explanation. Footage that apparently showed nothing. I bookmarked the thread, and then I sat with my laptop open, not doing anything for a while. My kids had a good time on that cruise. They talk about it sometimes, the pool deck and the fake-looking ocean and the dessert buffet at midnight. They didn't hear anything. They slept straight through the night of the 317 and every night after it, and they remember the whole trip as something warm and bright and uncomplicated. I don't correct them. I don't tell them about the door, the warmth of it under my hand. The 4 other passengers in a forum who heard what I heard and were told, as I was told, that the cabin beside them was empty. I don't tell them that empty rooms don't stay warm. And I don't tell them that whatever was in cabin 7144, I think it hurt us too. 7 years behind a cruise ship bar teaches you to read people the way a doctor reads vitals. You don't think about it consciously anymore. It just happens. The slight lean forward that means someone wants to talk. The way a person holds a glass when they're drinking to enjoy versus drinking to disappear. The eyes that find the door every few minutes versus the eyes that never look at anything at all. You develop a catalog. Thousands of passengers cycle through and most of them blur together within a season, but occasionally someone lands in your catalog differently. stays there, gets filed under a tab you didn't know you had. He was one of those. First night out of port, late sitting, maybe 11:30. The bar was still busy but thinning out. The early crowd had gone to bed and the real night crowd hadn't fully committed yet. He came in alone, sat at the far end of the bar nearest the window, and ordered a specific whiskey by distillery and age statement without looking at the menu. That's a small thing, but it registers. People who know exactly what they want before they sit down are either regulars somewhere or they've been thinking about the drink for a while. He was unhurried, settled into the stool like he'd sat in that exact spot before. Mid-50s, I'd estimate. Well-dressed but not flashy. The kind of clothes that cost money without announcing it. He had a face that had been through something at some point, lines that came from more than age, but his manner was composed. Pleasant when spoken to. Not unfriendly, not particularly warm. He tipped well. He sat facing the door. That last detail is the one I keep returning to. Every night, without exception, he chose a seat with a direct sight line to the entrance. On nights when that seat was taken, he'd wait at the bar standing until it cleared. He never sat with his back to the room. He never let anyone stand behind him for long without repositioning slightly. Most passengers don't move like that. Most passengers on a cruise ship are in full relaxation mode. Their guard is down, they're sunburned and full and slightly drunk, and they've temporarily forgotten that the world requires vigilance. He had not forgotten. Whoever he was, wherever he came from, he was a man who had never fully stopped watching the door. Night 2, he was there at the same time. Same seat. Same drink. Same precise positioning. We exchanged a few more words this time. I asked if he was enjoying the voyage. He said the ocean was the only place he slept well, which I found an interesting thing to say and filed away. Night 3, same. By night 4, I'd started having his drink ready slightly before he arrived, the way you do with regulars, and he acknowledged it with a small nod that felt more like recognition than gratitude. Like he expected eventually to be seen. We had a longer conversation on night 5. Nothing remarkable in content, the route, the weather, a passing comment about a port we were approaching. But his attention during conversation was very specific. He listened completely, the way very few people actually listen, and his eyes moved to the door between sentences in a rhythm so practiced it seemed involuntary. At one point, a group of passengers came in louder than the room expected, and his hand moved. Just slightly, just a fraction, toward his jacket pocket before he caught it and set it flat on the bar. He covered it smoothly. I don't think anyone else noticed. I noticed. Night 6, he didn't come in. I registered the absence the way you register any broken pattern. A small flag, nothing alarming. People miss nights. People eat late, fall asleep on the deck, get caught up in the casino. I didn't think about it deeply until the following afternoon, which is where this story changes entirely. I was in the crew corridor between the main bar and the service station, maybe 2 in the afternoon, doing nothing more significant than restocking a delivery manifest. One of the women from the guest relations team was coming the other direction. Someone I'd worked alongside for 2 contracts, good at her job, the kind of person who processes 30 passenger issues a day without losing composure. She was looking at something on her tablet as she walked and nearly went past me without stopping. Then she stopped. She was looking at my staff communication screen, which I'd propped against the shelf. Specifically at the crew photo that had populated when I'd logged into the bar management system, a passenger photo actually from the boarding manifest that I'd pulled up earlier when I was trying to match a tab to a name. I'd been going through the previous night's bar records and I'd pulled his photo to attach a name to the face. She stopped walking and she stared at that photo. I said her name, asked if she was all right. She looked up at me and then back at the screen, and her face had done something I hadn't seen it do in 2 contracts of working alongside her. Something had gone out of it. The composure was still there structurally, but underneath it something had shifted, the way ice looks solid from above right up until it isn't. She asked me where I'd gotten that photo. I told her it was from the boarding manifest. Current passenger, bar regular, I was matching a tab. She set her tablet down on the shelf very carefully. She picked up my screen and looked at the photo for another long moment. Close, the way someone looks when they're trying to find a discrepancy, trying to build a case against what they're seeing. Then she told me she needed to make a call, and she walked away quickly without her tablet. I stood there for a moment. Then I picked up her tablet because it was still open, and I am not proud of this, but I looked at what was on the screen. It was a missing persons coordination form. The kind that comes through the fleet network when a passenger is reported overboard or unaccounted for on another vessel. A cross-fleet alert, the maritime equivalent of a bulletin. It was dated 14 months prior. Different ship, different company, different ocean. There was a physical description. There was a case reference number. There was a photo. I looked at the photo on her tablet. I looked at the photo on my screen. The same face looked back at me from both. I put her tablet down. I restocked the rest of the delivery in a kind of autopilot state, not thinking clearly, running the calculation over and over and getting the same result each time. The man at my bar, the man who came in every night at 11:30, who knew exactly what he wanted, who never sat with his back to the room, whose hand had moved toward his jacket pocket when a loud noise surprised him, had been reported missing from a cruise ship 14 months ago, not as a suspect in anything, as a missing person, overboard presumed. He was on my passenger manifest as a living, boarded, paying guest, and he had been sitting at my bar for 5 nights. I went to the bar that evening and I thought about what to do with what I knew. The guest relations team member had made her call. Whatever was in motion without my involvement. My job was to pour drinks and read people and not get involved in things that had fleet-level coordination forms attached to them. He didn't come in that night either. The following morning I checked with a crew member I trusted about whether there had been any incident overnight, any passenger situation. He said nothing, which on a ship means either nothing happened or something happened that wasn't being discussed. Both are common. Both feel the same from the outside. We docked 2 days later. I watched the disembarkation from the bar service area. I watched passengers file off in the slow, luggage-laden procession that ends every voyage. I didn't see him. That means nothing. Disembarkation runs across 3 hours through multiple exits, and I was watching one corridor from a distance. I thought about who he was. About the gap between a missing persons report and a man sitting composed and watchful at a bar 14 months later. About why someone presumed lost at sea would be on a new ship with a current boarding pass and a preference for whiskey and a seat that never had its back to the door. The explanations that are innocent: misidentification on the missing persons form, a bureaucratic error, a man who resembles someone else closely enough to fool a photo comparison. All of them require me to dismiss what I saw on both those screens simultaneously. I looked carefully. I am good at faces. It's the job. The explanations that aren't innocent are harder to sit with. A man who disappeared off a ship and resurfaced on another one. Quieter, more watchful, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time making themselves hard to find. What was he running from? What had happened on that other ship? Whether the missing persons report was filed by people who were looking for him out of concern or filed by people who were looking for him for another reason entirely. I never found out. The guest relations team member transferred off the vessel at the next port rotation, and I never worked alongside her again. The bar records from that voyage are somewhere in a fleet archive I have no access to. But I still set up the good whiskey at the far end of the bar sometimes, out of habit, the seat nearest the window with the direct line to the door. And I still look up when a solo passenger comes in late, sits down without checking the menu, and orders something specific like they've been thinking about it for a long time. Just in case. Just to know. There are things you sign when you take a contract at sea that you don't fully understand until you're in a situation where they apply. Confidentiality clauses that seemed like standard legal boilerplate when you initialed them at a desk in a portside HR office become something different when you're standing in a cabin at 2 in the morning understanding for the first time exactly what they were written to cover. I was a medical officer. 8 years for different vessels, 2 different cruise lines. I dealt with everything the job produces. Cardiac events, allergic reactions, fractures from the pool deck, alcohol poisoning in quantities that would embarrass the passengers involved if they ever fully remembered. I delivered emergency care in conditions that shoreside colleagues wouldn't believe, with equipment limitations that required improvisation and the kind of calm that you either develop quickly in this job or you don't last in it. I was good at what I did. I was thorough. I kept clean records because clean records protect patients and they protect the practitioner, and in 11 years of medical training nobody had ever suggested to me that there was a third thing they might need to protect. I understand that now. It was the fourth night of a transatlantic crossing. 11 nights total, open ocean for most of it, the particular isolation of a crossing where there is no port stop coming, no land on any horizon, no option to evacuate a patient that doesn't involve a helicopter and a set of weather conditions that may or may not cooperate. That isolation changes the weight of every medical decision. I had always understood that intellectually. That night I understood it in my body. The call came at 2:14. Cabin on deck 8, passenger unresponsive. Traveling companion had found them when she returned from the late show. I took my kit and I moved fast because unresponsive covers a range that includes things you can still fix if you're quick enough. By the time I reached the cabin, it was clear that quick wouldn't help. The passenger was a man, somewhere in his late 60s by appearance. His traveling companion, a woman I understood to be his wife, was sitting on the edge of the second bed with her hands in her lap in the specific stillness of someone whose mind has gone somewhere it can't be reached from the outside. A junior crew member who'd responded to her initial call was standing near the door, not knowing where to look. I checked for pulse, for respiration, went through the assessment that you go through even when you already know. He had been gone for some time. The body was telling me things that I noted and would later write in a report. I administered the necessary protocols. I arranged for the wife to be taken to a separate cabin with a crew welfare officer. I began my documentation. Standard, methodical, the professional structure of it holding everything else at a distance the way it's designed to. Then I looked more carefully. I want to be precise here because precision is what I was trained for and precision is what I owe to what I'm about to describe. There were physical indicators present that were inconsistent with the cause of death I would have assigned based on his medical file. His file indicated a history of cardiac arrhythmia, pre-existing, documented, the kind of history that makes a cardiac event on a transatlantic crossing a foreseeable if tragic outcome. The kind of history that, administratively, makes a death very easy to categorize. The indicators I observed did not categorize easily. They suggested something that I will not specify in detail because I am not making an accusation and I have no proof and I signed documents that I am still bound by. What I will say is that I stood in that cabin for a long time after I should have moved on to the next procedural step, looking at what I was looking at, running the clinical assessment and arriving at a conclusion that I did not want to have arrived at. I radioed the ship's senior medical officer. He was there within 10 minutes. He looked at what I'd looked at. He was quiet for longer than felt procedural. Then he asked me to step outside the cabin with him. In the corridor, he spoke to me in a low, even voice. He told me that given the passenger's documented cardiac history, the cause of death would be recorded as cardiac arrest. He told me the death would be reported to the relevant maritime authorities per standard protocol. He told me the family would be informed and supported through the vessel's bereavement procedures. Then he told me that my incident notes from the initial assessment would need to be reviewed before filing. I asked what reviewed meant. He looked at me with an expression I have replayed many times since. Not threatening, not aggressive. Something more like exhaustion mixed with a very specific kind of regret. The expression of a person delivering news they have delivered before and have stopped expecting to feel good about. He said the notes would need to reflect the documented medical history. That on a vessel in open ocean, in the absence of forensic infrastructure, clinical observations of the kind I was describing created complications that served no one. Not the investigation that couldn't be properly conducted out here, not the family, not the passenger's dignity, and not my career. He used the word dignity. I have thought about that word a great deal. I went back to the medical bay. I sat at my documentation terminal for a long time. My initial notes were open on the screen, detailed, time-stamped, clinical, written in the language of a practitioner doing their job completely. I read them through twice. Then I thought about the wife sitting in a cabin somewhere on the deck above with her hands in her lap. I thought about what she would be told in the morning. I thought about whether what she was told would match what I had observed. I thought about her going home and sitting in a house that still had his things in it and understanding her husband's death as a cardiac event. A tragic but foreseeable outcome of a condition he'd lived with for years. Something that could have happened anywhere. Something that no one could have prevented. I thought about whether she deserved something more than that. And then I thought about the confidentiality documentation I had signed at a desk in a portside HR office and the 11 words I remembered most clearly from it. The 11 words I had initialed beside without fully understanding what situation would eventually make them specific. I amended the notes. Not fabricated. I want to be clear about the distinction because it matters to me even if it changes nothing practically. I did not write things that weren't there. I removed things that were. Clinical observations that I had made and documented and then undocumented because a man in a corridor outside a dead passenger's cabin had used the word dignity and the word complications and had looked at me with the face of someone who had done this before. I signed the amended report. The senior medical officer countersigned it. The cause of death was logged as cardiac arrest secondary to documented arrhythmia. The Maritime Authority notification was filed. The family was informed. I finished that contract. I did not renew it. I have thought about whether to have thought differently in that corridor. About whether a different version of me, less tired, less isolated, 11 days from land in any direction, would have held the line on those notes. I don't know. The conditions of that job, the specific geography of open ocean, the weight of the isolation, they do something to your decision-making that is hard to explain to people who haven't stood in a ship's corridor at 3 in the morning with nowhere to escalate to and a signed document in a filing cabinet that already knows your name. What I know is that a family was told something that night. Something clean and sad and explainable. Something that let them grieve in a straight line without the jagged edge of a question that could never be properly answered at sea. I tell myself that was a mercy. I tell myself that on the days when it feels like one. On the other days, I think about what clean records are actually for, about who they protect, about the difference between a document that serves a patient and a document that serves a ship. I left maritime medicine after that contract. I work in a clinic now. Small practice, same patients, the same faces coming back with the same complaints across years. My records are thorough. I review them myself before they're filed, and I don't let anyone tell me what they should reflect. I still think about that cabin, about what I observed and then removed from the record, about a woman with her hands in her lap being told something partial while I sat in a medical bay choosing between two versions of the truth. Both of them had her husband's death in them. Only one of them had all of it. I chose the one I chose. I'm not asking to be forgiven for it. I'm not sure forgiveness is the right category for what I did. I'm just telling you that it happened. That it happens. That somewhere in the administrative architecture of how cruise lines manage death at sea, there is space for things to be recorded one way when they may have been another way entirely. And that the people who board those ships with their luggage and their sunscreen and their first night excitement have absolutely no idea that space exists. Neither did I, until the night I used it. The first time I noticed it, I convinced myself I was wrong. That's the thing nobody warns you about with this kind of experience. The way your own mind becomes the first obstacle. Every rational instinct you have works against you, talks you down, smooths it over, files it under exhaustion or the general disorientation of being at sea for 9 days with no fixed geography outside your window. Your brain is very good at protecting you from conclusions you don't want to reach. It will work overtime. It will construct elaborate alternative explanations and deliver them with such quiet confidence that you'll thank it and move on. I moved on 4 times before I stopped moving on. It was a solo trip. 9-night Norwegian fjords cruise. Something I'd been planning for 2 years and saving carefully for. I booked a private cabin because I travel alone, and I've learned that the quality of a solo trip lives entirely on whether you have a space that belongs only to you. My cabin was on deck 6, midship, standard single occupancy. Small but sufficient. A narrow wardrobe, a desk bolted to the wall, a porthole that framed whatever was outside, gray water, gray sky, cliff faces sliding past like something from a painting done by someone who wanted to frighten you. I brought my own tea. I arranged everything on the first night with the specific care of a person who lives alone and knows exactly where they like things. That precision matters. Because what followed was a 9-day exercise in testing exactly how well I knew the position of every object in a room I occupied alone. It started on the 3rd morning. I came back from breakfast and the book on my desk had moved. Not dramatically, still on the desk, still in roughly the same area. But I read in bed and I set books on the desk spine up, fanned open to my last page, every time without thinking about it. Habit so ingrained it bypasses conscious decision. This book was spine down, closed. placed parallel to the desk edge with a neatness that looked deliberate, the way you'd position something if you were tidying a surface, not the way I set things down when I'm finished with them. I stood there for a moment, turned it back over, found my page, moved on. Cabin steward, I told myself. Morning service, tidying surfaces, perfectly standard. I had no reason to think otherwise, and I actively chose not to. That afternoon I returned from the viewing deck. We were passing Grangerfjord, the kind of landscape that makes you understand why people invented the word sublime, and my toiletry bag on the bathroom shelf had been rotated. It lived with the zip facing left, toward the mirror. It was facing right toward the wall. The zip was closed when I never close it because I go in and out of it constantly throughout the day. Everything inside was present. Nothing was missing. It had simply been opened, gone through, closed, and replaced facing the wrong direction. I sat on the bed for a while. I thought about the cabin steward again. I thought about whether I was the kind of person who notices which way a toiletry bag faces and decided I was absolutely that kind of person, which was either a reassurance or a problem depending on how you looked at it. I went to guest services and asked, as casually as I could manage, whether the cabin steward did a second service in the afternoons. She confirmed morning service only unless requested. I hadn't requested anything. I asked if anyone else had keycard access to my cabin. She said only the steward and security, for emergencies. She asked if something was wrong. I said no. I said I was just curious about the service schedule. That night, I arranged everything with intention. I set the book spine up, fanned open. I positioned the toiletry bag zip-facing left. I placed my journal at a specific angle on the desk corner and put a pen across it in a particular way, the lid facing the window, sitting at maybe 20 degrees off parallel. Small enough to look accidental, specific enough that I'd know. In the morning, all of it was the same. I felt something that was partly relief and partly, if I'm being precise, disappointment. Because I had spent a night building a small test and the test had come back clean, and now I had nothing but my own imperfect memory and a toiletry bag that may have always faced right. I let it go entirely for 2 days. I stopped checking. I stopped cataloging. I had booked a beautiful cruise through extraordinary scenery, and I was going to be present for it instead of auditing the orientation of my personal belongings. On the 7th night, I came back to the cabin after dinner and stood in the doorway before I turned the light on. Something was different, and I felt it before I could see it. The air in the cabin was wrong. Not the temperature. The ship's air conditioning ran at a consistent coolness that I'd adapted to. Something subtler. A residue of presence, the way a room holds the shape of a person who has just left it. You know the feeling. You walk into a room someone has recently been in and there's a warmth. A disturbance in the stillness that hasn't fully settled yet. It's not imagined. It's physical. Air moves differently around people, and for a short time after they leave it still carries the echo of that movement. My cabin felt like that. I stood in the doorway without moving for what was probably 30 seconds. Then I turned the light on and looked. The pen on my journal, the one I'd positioned at 20 degrees off parallel, lid toward the window. I'd placed it there again that morning, casually, as a continuation of the habit I'd built. I had not told myself I was testing anything. I had just placed it that way because that was how it lived now. It was parallel, lit away from the window, moved perhaps 4 inches to the left of where I'd put it and laid flat and straight as if someone had absently straightened it while reading what was underneath. I picked up the journal. I am not going to describe what I felt looking at the cover of it because it doesn't translate well and it wasn't a dramatic feeling anyway. It was the feeling of something confirming itself quietly, the feeling of a door closing on the version of events where you were wrong. I didn't open the journal. I stood holding it and I looked at the cabin with different eyes than I'd looked at it before. Someone had been in this room. Not during the morning service, because the pen hadn't been moved at morning service. In the afternoon, the evening, some window between my leaving for dinner at 7 and my returning at 9:40. Someone with keycard access had come into my cabin and moved a pen and breathed in my air and looked at my things and left again. And taken nothing, damaged nothing, left no note, no sign, no indication of purpose. I went to security that night. I reported it formally this time, no casual framing, no pretending I was just curious. I told them what I'd observed over 7 days, the pattern of small displacements, the test, the result. The security officer who took my report was professional and thorough and wrote everything down. He told me they would pull the keycard access log from my cabin for the duration of the voyage. He came back to me the next morning. The log, he said, showed keycard access to my cabin on the following occasions: my own entry and exit, and the steward's morning service visits. That was it. No additional entries. No unaccounted access. The log was clean. I asked if the log could be wrong. He said keycard systems were reliable but not infallible. Technical anomalies were rare but possible. He said they'd review the corridor security footage for the timeframes I'd described. He came back that afternoon. The corridor footage, he told me, showed nothing that raised concern during the relevant windows. He said it with the careful flatness of someone delivering a result they believe and someone delivering a result they've been told to deliver, and I could not tell which one he was. I had one night left on that voyage. I didn't sleep much of it. I lay in the dark and I listened to the ship breathe around me, and I thought about the particular horror of what I was actually dealing with, which wasn't a dramatic horror, wasn't a violent horror, wasn't anything I could point to and name. It was the horror of a space you're supposed to own, a room you paid for, locked, filled with your things, and the creeping, unverifiable, systemically denied knowledge that it wasn't entirely yours. Someone had a key, or didn't need one. Someone had come in and moved small things and gone out again, and either the systems that were supposed to record that had no record of it, or the people reading those systems had reasons to tell me they didn't. I disembarked in Bergen on a cold gray morning. I collected my luggage and I stood on the pier and I looked back at the ship the way you do, the way everyone does, that involuntary backward glance at the thing you've been living inside. It looked ordinary. Clean lines, bright hull, passengers still filing down the gangway behind me with their suitcases and their photographs and their uncomplicated memories of fjords. I turned away and I didn't look back again. I still travel alone. I still book solo cabins because the quality of a solo trip lives on having a space that's yours. But I arrange things differently now. Not casually. Not out of habit. I arrange them with the specific, deliberate attention of someone who needs to know with absolute certainty every single time they return to a room, whether they are truly the only one who has been in it. So far, the answer has been yes. I check anyway. Every time. I check anyway. I was 22 the first time I understood that some places remember you even when you wish they wouldn't. It was the 14th of October, 2019. A Tuesday. I remember the day specifically because I'd been trying to reschedule that shoot for 2 weeks. Rain, then a last-minute client call, then more rain. Chicago had finally decided to cooperate, offering one of those rare autumn afternoons where the light turns everything copper and the air smells like cold earth and something almost sweet underneath it. I grabbed my camera bag, threw on my jacket, and drove 40 minutes north to Rose Hill Cemetery. I'd heard about Rose Hill from another photographer in a Facebook group. Someone had posted a series of shots taken there in fall, and the images were extraordinary. Old Gothic architecture, massive oak trees, monuments that looked like they belonged in a European capital rather than the north side of Chicago. I'd never been before. I didn't know anyone buried there. For me, it was purely aesthetic, the light, the texture, the age of the place. I was doing a personal project on forgotten spaces, and Rose Hill felt like exactly what I needed. I signed in at the front office the way you're supposed to, paid the small photography fee, got a paper map, and walked in through the main iron gate just after 2 in the afternoon. The place was enormous. Over 300 acres, the woman at the desk had told me, so I wasn't expecting to see many people. A few scattered visitors, maybe, possibly a maintenance worker or two. For the first hour, I was completely alone. And I mean that in the best possible way. There is a specific kind of quiet that exists inside very old cemeteries that you genuinely cannot find anywhere else. Not silence exactly. Birds were moving through the trees, and somewhere distant a leaf blower hummed on and off, but a quality of stillness underneath all of it that felt almost deliberate. Like the place was listening. I moved slowly, stopping every few minutes to frame a shot. An iron fence overtaken by ivy. A marble angel with one wing broken at the shoulder. A family monument so old the names had been almost entirely swallowed by weather and moss. I was maybe 90 minutes in, crouched near a low stone wall trying to get the angle right on a cluster of Victorian-era markers, when I looked up and saw him. He was standing perhaps 200 feet away, near a tree line that separated one section of the cemetery from another. Tall, wearing dark work clothes, the kind of thick canvas jacket groundskeeping crews wear in colder months. He had a rake in one hand, though he wasn't using it. He was just standing there, facing in my direction, still enough that I noticed. I raised my hand in a small wave, the awkward reflex you have when you make unexpected eye contact with a stranger in a quiet place. He waved back, and then he said my name, not loudly, not shouted across 200 feet the way you'd have to shout to be heard. But I heard it, clearly, my first name, spoken at a perfectly normal conversational volume, as if he were standing right beside me. I felt it more than heard it, like the word moved through the air differently than sound should. I stood up straight. I looked at him. He had already turned away, moving slowly toward the tree line with the rake dragging slightly behind him. I told myself I'd misheard. I told myself he'd said something else. Some groundskeeping term, some call to a coworker I hadn't seen. I picked up my camera and kept shooting for another 40 minutes, moving in the opposite direction, telling myself the tightness in my chest was just the cold air. But here's the thing about that afternoon that I have never been able to file away neatly. When I stopped at the front office on my way out, I asked the woman at the desk about the groundskeeping crew, specifically whether they worked the east section on Tuesdays. She looked at her computer, then looked up at me with the particular expression of someone who doesn't understand why you're asking. She said there was no crew scheduled that day. Budget reasons. They only ran crews Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and even then not in the east section until spring cleanup. I described him, the height, the jacket, the rake. She was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Then she asked me, carefully, which section of the east grounds I'd been in. I showed her on the map the cluster of Victorian markers, the low stone wall, the tree line. She looked at the map for a moment without saying anything. Then she said very evenly that that section contained some of the cemetery's oldest plots, mostly from the 1880s through the early 1900s, and also a smaller cluster from the mid-20th century. She did not say anything else. She did not explain the pause. She handed me back my map and thanked me for visiting. I have thought about that pause almost every day since. I didn't look at my photos until 2 days later. I'd shot nearly 400 frames that afternoon, not unusual for a full shoot, and I worked through them methodically the way I always do, flagging the keepers, trashing the obvious misfires. I was almost at the end of the afternoon's work when I came across a frame I didn't fully remember taking. It was shot looking roughly northeast, toward the tree line where I'd seen him. I'd clearly been trying to capture the light breaking through the oaks. The composition was mine, the framing was deliberate. But in the lower left corner of the frame, near the tree line, there was a shape. I want to be precise here because I think precision matters. It was not a clear figure. It was not the kind of thing you'd see and immediately think person. It was a vertical darkness against the trees that had a quality of density the surrounding shadows didn't share. If I'd been scrolling quickly, I might have passed it entirely. But I wasn't scrolling quickly, and the longer I looked at it, the less I was able to convince myself it was a trick of light or a darkened trunk or anything that belonged to the natural geometry of that tree line. I zoomed in until the image pixelated. Whatever it was standing exactly where he had been standing. Not moving. Not facing away the way he'd been when I last saw him. Facing the camera. I sent the photo to 2 other photographers I trust. Didn't tell them what I'd seen or what I was looking for. Just asked them to look at the image and tell me what they noticed. One of them wrote back within an hour and said, "What is that near the trees on the left?" The other one took 3 days and then said, "I don't want to freak you out, but there's something in this photo. I can't tell what it is. I kind of don't want to keep looking at it." I went back to the cemetery's historical records online. Rosehill has a fairly detailed database of burials that's accessible to the public, maintained partly by volunteers and partly by the cemetery itself. I searched the east section, the Victorian names, the early 20th century markers. And then, in the mid-century cluster the woman at the desk had mentioned without elaborating, I found something that I genuinely did not know what to do with. A groundskeeper, listed by occupation, died on the property in October of 1987. A work accident, the record indicated without further detail. His plot was in the east section near the tree line because he'd reportedly requested it. He'd worked at Rosehill for over 30 years. He apparently loved the place. I am not going to tell you his name, not because I'm protecting anyone. He has no living family that I could find, but because saying his name out loud in this context feels like something I'm not prepared to do. What I will tell you is that when I read his physical description in the historical notes attached to his record, written by the volunteer who'd compiled the entry, something in my chest went quiet in a way that was not comfortable. Tall, dark work jacket, had a habit of greeting visitors by name, according to former staff who'd been interviewed for the record. Management had apparently asked him about it more than once. How he always seemed to know the names of people he'd never met. He'd never had a good answer for it. He just said he had a good memory for faces, and the faces always told him the name. He died on October 14th, not 2019, 1987, the same date, 32 years earlier to the day. I have not returned to Rosehill. I want to be honest about that. Not because I'm afraid exactly, though I think fear is somewhere in it. More because I don't know what I would be returning for. To confirm something? To disprove it? I have the photo. I have the record. I have the memory of a name spoken across 200 feet of empty October air in a way that should not have been physically possible. I still do that personal project. Forgotten spaces, old places, the way absence accumulates in certain locations. I've photographed a lot of cemeteries since that afternoon. I always sign in at the front office. I always pay the fee. I always keep track of who's around me, and I never wave at strangers near tree lines. And sometimes, in the middle of a shoot in a quiet section of a very old place, I feel the particular stillness that I first noticed at Rosehill, that sense of something underneath the silence, listening. I lower my camera. I don't look toward the trees. I almost didn't take that crossing. The booking had been sitting in my email for 3 weeks. A transatlantic, Southampton to New York. 8 nights of open ocean with nothing to do but read and eat and exist without the particular weight of the life I was temporarily leaving behind. I'd gone through a difficult year. Not dramatically difficult, not the kind of difficult that makes for a clean story with a clear cause. Just the accumulated, grinding kind where you wake up one morning and realize you've been running on fumes for so long you've forgotten what full felt like. A friend had suggested the crossing specifically. No flights, no rushing, no destination anxiety. Just the water and the time and the slow forward movement of a ship that knows where it's going even when you don't. I booked it 3 days before departure. Solo cabin, midship, deck 7. I packed light. I told myself I was going to read 6 books and speak to no one and arrive in New York feeling like a person again. I met him on the second morning. The crossing has a particular social rhythm that land travel doesn't. The same faces cycling through the same spaces over 8 days creates an intimacy that forms faster than it would anywhere else. You start recognizing people by their habits. The woman who takes the same deck chair every morning regardless of weather. The elderly couple who walk the promenade together at exactly 7 and exactly 4. And him, quiet, always with a book, always at the same table in the forward observation lounge where the windows gave the widest angle of the ocean ahead. I sat near him by coincidence on the second morning because every other window table was taken and I wanted the light. We didn't speak for the first hour. Then he made a remark about the book I was reading. Something specific, something that told me he'd read it and thought about it carefully. And the conversation that followed had the quality of conversations that feel like they were waiting to happen. Easy. Substantive. The kind you have with someone whose mind works at a frequency you recognize. His name was something that started with a D. I'll leave it there for reasons that will become obvious. I'll call him D. He was traveling alone, he said, taking time. He had the manner of someone between chapters of their life. Not lost exactly, but unanchored, moving through a pause that he hadn't yet decided the meaning of. I recognized it because I was in something similar. That recognition is its own kind of bond. You don't have to explain the weight because the other person is already carrying a version of it. We had dinner together that evening. Not planned, we arrived at the dining room at the same time and the maitre d' seated us together with the cheerful pragmatism of someone managing a full room. Felt like continuation rather than arrangement. We talked for 2.5 hours. About books, about work, about the particular loneliness of being functional. of being someone who appears fine to everyone around them while something underneath runs quietly wrong. He talked about it with a precision that suggested he'd spent a long time understanding it. I found myself saying things I hadn't said to people I'd known for years. By the fourth day, we had a loose routine. Morning coffee in the observation lounge. An afternoon walk on the promenade deck. 2 or 3 circuits in whatever weather the Atlantic was producing, which was rarely gentle. Dinner together most evenings. He was good company in the specific way of people who know how to be present, who don't fill silence with noise, who ask questions they actually want the answers to, who make you feel that the conversation you're having is the only place they'd rather be. I noticed small things. He never talked about where he'd come from specifically. When the conversation moved toward the concrete details of his life, where he lived, what his work had been, people he knew, he'd answer and then redirect smoothly the way a skilled conversationalist moves a topic without the other person feeling moved. I noticed, but I didn't pursue it. I was doing some version of the same thing. The crossing felt like neutral territory, suspended between one life and the next, and I think we both understood that the details lived on the other side of that suspension and didn't need to come aboard. On the 6th night, there was a formal dinner. The kind cruise ships produce mid-voyage, the dressing up, the extended menu, the social performance of it. We sat together. He was good at the formal version of the evening in the way that suggested he'd been good at it for a long time and was tired of it. We walked the deck afterward in the dark, leaning on the rail, looking at the water. He said something I've thought about many times since. He said that the thing about open ocean was that it had no memory, that whatever you'd done or hadn't done or been or failed to be, out here none of it had a location. It just floated free. I thought it was melancholy in a beautiful way, the kind of thing a person says when they're processing something large. I said something about arriving in New York and starting fresh, and he smiled at the water and didn't respond to that directly. We exchanged numbers on the last morning. Southampton contacts, both of us. We were both heading back to the UK eventually, he said, once New York had done whatever New York was going to do for him. We hugged briefly on the gangway in the gray New York morning, and then the crowd of disembarkation separated us, and I walked into the city feeling more like a person than I had in a year. He never answered a single message. Not immediately. I wasn't alarmed at first. People decompress after long travel. People get absorbed back into their lives. I sent 2 messages over the first week, casual, no pressure. Nothing. I sent a third a fortnight later, more direct. Just checking you got here all right. Nothing. The number wasn't disconnected. It simply received and returned silence. Put it away. People retreat. Whatever he'd been processing on that crossing, perhaps arrival had redirected him entirely. I felt the loss of the easy conversation more than I expected to, but I filed it under things that belong to a specific time and place and don't always survive the return to ordinary geography. 8 months later, I was on a community forum for solo travelers, the kind of online space where people share itineraries and recommendations and occasionally warnings. I was reading a thread about transatlantic crossings, thinking about booking another one, running through the comments. Halfway down the page, someone had posted about the Southampton to New York route. Positive review mostly, but in the middle of it, a paragraph about a strange experience. They'd found a missing persons post on a UK community board after the voyage, sharing it as a curiosity, and the photo attached to the missing persons listing was of a man they'd seen briefly on their crossing. They'd included the link. I don't know what made me click it. Idle curiosity, probably. The slight surreal interest of someone who'd recently done the same route. The page loaded. I looked at the photo for a long time. It was him. Not similar. Not a resemblance. The same face I had sat across from for 8 evenings. The same face that had looked at the Atlantic and said it had no memory. The name on the listing was different from what he'd told me. Not dramatically different, a different first name, but the face was absolute. Unambiguous. I have a good memory for faces, and I had spent 8 days across a dinner table from this one. The listing had been posted 2 years before our crossing. 2 years before I met him on that ship, someone, a family member by the tone of the post, someone writing with the specific exhausted grief of a person who has been searching for a long time, had reported him missing. The post said he had last been seen leaving his home in the south of England with minimal belongings. No note. No stated destination. The family was requesting any information, any sighting, any contact. I sat with my laptop open for a long time, not doing anything. I thought about everything he'd said across those 8 days. The precision with which he'd talked about the weight of being functional while something runs wrong underneath. The way he'd deflected concrete details. What he'd said on the deck in the dark about the ocean having no memory. About things floating free of their location. I thought about him saying he was heading back to the UK eventually, once New York had done whatever it was going to do for him. I thought about the number that received my messages and returned silence. I thought about a family somewhere who had been searching for 2 years and who did not know that their person had been on a ship in the Atlantic, eating dinner, walking the promenade in the gray morning weather, talking about books with a stranger who found him easy company and had no idea. I still don't know whether to have contacted them. I made the decision not to, and I've remade it several times since going the other direction and then back again. He was alive when I knew him. He was present and thoughtful, and he chose, for reasons I was not given, to be unfindable. Whether that choice deserved to be respected or reported, I've turned that question over for a long time without arriving anywhere satisfying. What I keep returning to is the last thing he said on the gangway. Not the hug, not the exchanged numbers. Just before, looking back at the ship one last time the way everyone does. He said, "That was exactly what I needed." I thought he meant the crossing. I've wondered since if he meant something harder to name than that. A last stretch of time in which he existed to someone else as simply himself, unlocated, between chapters, floating free of everything that had a claim on him on land. The ocean has no memory. He told me that. He was right about a lot of things. I just wish I'd understood at the time what it was he was saying goodbye to. The fourth note was the one that stopped me sleeping. Not because of what it said, because of what it meant that it was there at all. Folded in the same way, placed in the same position, outside a cabin door that according to every document I could access had been empty since the morning we left port. By the fourth night I had stopped trying to explain it and started trying to survive the remaining days of that voyage with the particular endurance of someone who knows something is wrong and has been told, clearly and without room for negotiation, that it is not their problem to understand. I had been a cabin steward for 4 years by then. 2 vessels, 3 contracts, the kind of experience that turns a job into a body of knowledge you carry without thinking about it. I knew the rhythms of a ship the way you know the layout of a house you've lived in for years, not consciously, not by consulting anything, just a deep physical familiarity with how things feel when they're right and an immediate involuntary alertness when something is off. I knew which cabin doors stuck in humid weather. I knew which corridor lights flickered on the turn before the generator cycled. I knew the sound the ship made in heavy swells versus light ones, the particular vocabulary of a vessel communicating its own condition to the people who knew how to listen. I knew, by the second night, that something about cabin 1114 was off. My round on that voyage covered the full length of deck 11. 42 cabins, morning and evening service for all occupied rooms. The assignment sheet I received at embarkation had cabin 1114 marked with a simple notation I'd seen before on repositioning cruises and occasional full sailings. Unoccupied, no service required. A booking canceled pre-departure. A cabin held for operational reasons. Nothing unusual. I'd walked past unoccupied cabins thousands of times. You register them the way you register a gap in a sentence. Briefly, automatically, moving on. The first note was on the evening of day 2. I was doing my evening round, working from the aft end of the corridor forward, and it was there on the floor at the base of cabin 1114's door. A folded piece of paper, small, the size you'd get from tearing a standard sheet into quarters. It was placed rather than dropped. There is a difference, and I notice it. Dropped paper lands with randomness, skewed angle, and edge lifting. This was flat, centered, the fold facing up, positioned with a deliberateness that was subtle enough to be deniable but present enough that I registered it before I'd consciously decided to. I picked it up. My first instinct was that it had slid out from under the door, that someone had pushed a note out rather than in, which made no sense given the cabin was empty but was the most immediate framing my brain reached for. I looked at it for a moment. Then I did what I would have done with any misplaced item in a corridor. I slid it back under the door, assuming it belonged to whoever had last occupied the space, and continued my round. On day 3 it was there again. Same note. I recognized the fold, a specific trifold, 2 creases of slightly unequal width, The kind that happens when someone folds paper quickly by feel rather than measuring. Same position, same placement, flat, centered, deliberate. I stood in the corridor for a longer moment this time. The ship was moving through calm water, a quiet night, the corridor empty in both directions. The privacy light on 1114 store panel was unlit. Unoccupied rooms don't activate the privacy function because there's no guest to activate it. The door looked like every other door on the corridor. Unremarkable. Closed. I slid the note back under again. I told myself there was a rational sequence of events producing this and I hadn't identified it yet. Maybe the note was working its way back out through a gap in the door seal. Maybe a passenger from a nearby cabin had placed it there by mistake, retrieved it, placed it again. Maybe I was misremembering where I'd put it the night before. I was not misremembering. On day 4 I didn't slide it back. I opened it. For words. Handwritten in a small, careful script. The letters formed with the deliberate neatness of someone who had learned to write in a system that valued precision.
No signature.
No cabin number, no name, no context that would let me attach it to a person or a situation or a category of things I knew how to handle. I'm not going to write what those 4 words were. I've thought about why I'm making that choice, and I think it comes down to this. The words themselves were not frightening in isolation. Written in any other context, they would have been ordinary. It was the combination of those specific words, in that specific place, in that specific handwriting, appearing outside a door that sealed an empty room on the 4th night of a voyage, that made them into something else entirely. Something I cannot convey by simply transcribing them because the meaning of them lived in the accumulation of everything surrounding them, not in the words alone. I reported it that night. My supervisor listened to me with the careful patience of someone deciding in real time how seriously to take what they're hearing. She came with me to the corridor. She looked at the note. She looked at the door. She took the note from me, folded it once more along its existing creases, and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she told me to reroute my evening rounds to begin from the forward end of the corridor instead of the aft, which would mean I approached 1114 last rather than mid-round. She said it was a scheduling adjustment. She said it without looking at me directly. I asked her if she was going to check the cabin. She said she would handle it. I asked if I should file anything, a maintenance note, an incident flag, anything that would create a record of what I'd found and when. She said there was nothing to file. The way she said it was the thing. Not dismissive. She wasn't a dismissive person, and in 4 years of this work, I developed a reasonable ability to distinguish between a supervisor who thinks you're wasting their time and a supervisor who is managing information. She was managing information. There was something behind the evenness of her voice that was doing work, holding something in place, and I felt the specific chill of being on the wrong side of a boundary I hadn't known existed until I was standing at it. I rerouted my rounds as instructed. On day 5, I reached cabin 1114 at the end of my evening pass, and the corridor outside it was empty. No note. I stood there for a moment in the way that you stand in a place where something has been happening and is suddenly not happening, the absence registering as its own kind of presence. Day 6. Nothing. Day 7, the final full day before we docked. I was finishing my morning service and I passed the cabin and the door was open. Not wide. Maybe 30 centimeters. The gap you get when a door hasn't been fully latched and the ship's movement has worked it loose. I could see the slice of interior that the gap revealed, the edge of a bed, the foot of it, the standard blue-gray of the ship's cabin carpeting. The bed had been slept in. The covers were pushed back in the specific way of someone who has gotten up and not straightened them. There was an indentation in the pillow that was still visible from where I stood in the corridor. I did not open the door further. I want to be honest about that. I considered it and I chose not to. Whatever was on the other side of that 30-centimeter gap had been producing folded notes and resisting every administrative category I tried to put it in, and I was 2 days from the end of my contract, and I made a decision that was not the brave decision but was the one I was capable of making at 7:40 in the morning in an empty corridor. I latched the door. I continued my round. At disembarkation the following morning, I watched the passenger flow from the Deck 11 corridor. My supervisor managed the process at the forward end. I was at the aft. I watched every person who came out of every cabin, cases, bags, the shuffling, unhurried procession of people returning to their land-based lives. Nobody came out of cabin 1114. The door was closed. The corridor emptied around it. The ship docked and the gangways went down and the passengers moved through the system and the cabin sat in the thinning silence of a vessel at the end of a voyage with its door closed and whatever it contained still inside. I handed in my service clipboard at the end of the disembarkation process. My supervisor was there. Our eyes met briefly. She said I'd done good work that contract and she hoped to see me on the next rotation. She did not mention the corridor. She did not mention the note she had folded and put in her jacket pocket. She did not mention what she had or hadn't found when she said she would handle it. I didn't ask. I collected my things and I walked off that ship and I stood on the dock in the thin morning light and I breathed air that wasn't recycled and I thought about 4 words in a careful handwriting and a bed that had been slept in and a door that nobody came out of. I never went back to that vessel. I think about 1114 sometimes. Not every day, less than I used to. But on certain nights when something is quieter than it should be, when the silence has a texture to it that feels less like absence and more like presence, I think about a folded note on a corridor floor outside a door that the manifest said was empty. And I think about whoever was on the other side of it, writing 4 words in a careful hand, pushing them out into a corridor, and waiting to see if anyone would answer. The ocean is 7 miles deep in places, and in all that depth, in all that darkness, there is no record kept, no log filed, no manifest that accounts for everything that moves through it. These 9 people sat down and told you the truth, or the closest thing to it they were allowed to tell. Whatever you do next, whatever ship you book, whatever cabin you're assigned, whatever corridor you walk at 3 in the morning, remember that the water underneath you has no memory. But some things do. Welcome to Bleak Fears. Don't forget to subscribe.